my background, let me give you some background on who we are and what we're going to try and do today. I'm an architect and an acoustician, 42 years practicing architecture and acoustics, predominantly building recording studios, starting in 1969, 3,000 studios later. We're still doing it. Our firm is Walters-Storyk Design Group, and we have offices in 5 countries, about 50 people. So that's the advertorial and a little bit of a setting of who we are. Why are we here today? A lot of churches have studios, and in particular, we're going to visit one church that has had a studio for 10 years, Pastor Joe's church. Our offices are in New York, South America, Miami, Europe, and we have branched out now into more or less any kind of architecture technology, audiovisual systems, home theaters, technology architecture. For me personally, I make no distinction between architecture, technology, and acoustics. That's the first slide. It's an equation. To me, it's all the same. It's all design, and I think that's been the premise for how I've viewed my life's work, which is not over yet, I hope. And so that's a background as to what we are. So for the first part of what we're going to do today, this could be a tour through this subject. At best, I'm hoping to have everybody continue to fall in love with this subject, not be afraid of technology. I feel like we're preaching to the choir a little bit here, since this is a technology convention. Joe is the pastor at Crossroads Tabernacle. This is a rather large church in the Bronx, New York, which we had the privilege and pleasure of working with Joe to, at first, build a recording studio. That's actually why Joe called. He had a small studio and wanted to expand it. Our work at the church later grew to essentially the entire renovation of the church, and it was quite an adventure in how technology and architecture could influence so many lives, including my own, and how it still is influencing our lives. Some of the crossroads, some of the hurdles that we had to deal with as we were building this, financial hurdles, technological hurdles, etc. So that's basically what we're going to try and do today, and maybe demystify or take some of the fear out of this work, this combination of architecture and technology, which we all know we need. Are we going to go slide by slide? You're just going to move them forward manually? Okay. Some of these are really more so that we can just guide ourselves along. We'll get to the pictures pretty quick. Again, for me, architecture and acoustics, it's a love affair. I make no distinction between the two. And if anybody leaves with a message today, neither should be second fiddle to the other. Yes, it seems like we have to have a plan layout first, and of course we have to deal with finances and how many people we're going to sit in a congregation space, et cetera, but try not to think of technology and acoustics as as subjects or disciplines that are added after the fact. Try to embrace them from the beginning of the project. Life will be so much easier and so much happier and so much more fun. The architectural solution to a church design, the technological solution, and the acoustical solution are all the same. We have a lot of cool tools and toys that help us do this. We're going to take a look at a few of them today. And this adventure in combining all 3 of these could be fun and should be fun. Let's go to the next slide real quick. Okay? I guess I'll just have to cue you. So our first adventure here is technology and audio. Let's continue. Hit the slide button again. Okay, so this is not queuing in exactly the way I thought. We unfortunately, the slides I guess they sort of got transferred into a PDF style version. So what we're not seeing in these 2 slides was a kind of neat little graphic that showed the difference between traditional loudspeakers and beam steering loudspeakers. This is one of the newer technologies that we see. Okay, a traditional loudspeaker, even a traditional loudspeaker, of course, would just simply radiate sound, okay, from a point source. A line array is an expansion of that. Most churches will use line arrays. Everybody's pretty familiar with that. Beam steering, which would be on the next slide, would be a slightly newer method of dealing with speakers, where we could take a long, thin column of speakers, okay, something similar to this. I'm not quite sure if these are in fact DSP controlled, but by controlling lots of little speakers, we could get that speaker to essentially turn, steer, basically direct itself any way we want. This is going to become particularly valuable. So why would this be valuable? Well, it would be valuable in an instance where we only had one position where we could put a speaker. What would be an example of that? An architectural or an historical example. Let's go to another slide. Okay, so for instance, in this slide, we don't have the option of hanging big line arrays. A lot of us are all used to that. There are a lot of line array exhibitors right here. In Joe's church, we had the ability to do, we had the height. The architecture was not in conflict with line arrays, okay, and they work very well. But sometimes we don't have that opportunity. So this is an example where embracing technology, understanding technology, not being afraid of technology, and doing all this from the very, very beginning of a project, okay, would have a huge payoff. Okay, in this particular case, I think you can quickly see that any kind of line array would have been inappropriate. In some instances, it's illegal. Okay, if it was an historical situation. So that tiny little speaker, okay, which looks like it would just simply be radiating sound straight out, which of course would not do us any good, is in fact radiating the sound down. We can control it. We can beam steer it with DSP control. Wow. Now let's continue. You want to hit the next slide? Great. So here's an example. This is the kind of prediction tool that is now very readily available. Some of you are familiar with this. This would be an ease model where we can essentially predict, in this case, a line array, not a beam steering speaker. But these prediction tools are relatively easy to use. Not the kind of thing you might want to deal with yourself, but very easy to now predict exact sound levels and coverage patterns for halls and spaces up to thousands and thousands of people, and we use them every day. Let's go to the next slide. No chance of getting that clicker to work, right? Oh, he's working. You're working on it. Okay. So here's an example. This is not a church, but it could be a church. In fact, it's a pretty famous performance hall in New York. This is Jazz at Lincoln Center. Okay, and this is up here for another reason. Okay, this is an example of a line array. Some of you might have seen it in the news recently because they just recently swapped these JBL speakers for Myers speakers, which actually I agree with the swap. But these are, oh, okay, somebody else agrees also. There's a little history on that, but we won't get into it. So the reason that I put this up, okay, is again that technology was the friend of the architecture here. Here the architecture started with this giant glass wall. Now a big 40 by 60 foot glass wall behind a performance area or a ministry area or a speaking area is not exactly how you would probably start from a theatrical point of view. This would not have been the ideal surface for me to start with, this big giant glass wall. In this case, this is a jazz performing hall. Okay, so why did we start with it? Well, it was sort of handed to us by the architects of the building. No problem, we'll just have to deal with it. How did we deal with it? Angling the glass, the ceiling, which has this sort of sweeping architectural shape, which was the brainchild of Raphael Vignoli, the architect for this project, turns out to be really thin tubes, which give the illusion of a swooping ceiling. The tubes then allow the sound to go through them. They're spaced at about 8 inches, and now everything above, which is actually about 20 feet above it, is dealing with all the acoustics. If you go upstairs and you turn the lights on, the work lights, what you would see is hundreds and hundreds of 2-foot square diffusers. So in fact, all the energy bounces off the glass, goes up through the transparent ceiling, which you don't realize is transparent because it's all black above it, okay? Hits the diffusers, comes back down more or less like rain, and the sound is enhanced. Even the side walls, which sort of look flat and even look parallel, are in fact not. They're flat and they're parallel, but in fact when you take the fabric off the covers, you'll see that 50% of them are diffusers and 50% of them are membrane absorbers controlling the low frequency sound. So again, architecture, design, technology, the speakers and acoustics, all happily married from the beginning of the design process. Go to the next one. Okay. More displays of some of the tools we use. So these are this is for the big giant concert hall in Lucerne. Keep going. And this is maybe Switzerland's most famous concert hall. So we're going to just continue to flash these slides. Here's another example of where the goal was to simply not see the speakers. And sometimes that is the goal. I personally like seeing technology, but not everybody likes it. Not everybody's in love with it. Sometimes it's not appropriate. In this case, it was absolutely not appropriate. So where are all these speakers? They're basically hidden inside the columns. We have little tiny delay speakers, and then in the front, covered by fabric, are two big giant beam steering vertical columns, which put the sound exactly where we want it to be. And we have to be very careful in a room like this to try and keep the sound as far away from that big glass wall as possible. So more assembly speakers. Now this is an example of clearly where the law would prohibit us from really changing the room at all. This is the Parliament in Switzerland. This is the Congress for the country of Switzerland, the Swiss Parliament, and you can see you can see right over on that one right there, and right over there. You can see some of the speakers, but most of the speakers are really invisible. And the modeling on this was intense to get this to work. More examples of assembly spaces. In this case, the line array was appropriate, okay, and was actually the right solution. When you have at least one, let alone two balconies, a line array is really the best way to go. A lot of us are familiar with that. Another example of architecture and technology meeting each other from the very beginning. When you look at this room, your first inclination would be to think that this would make an amazing concert hall. This would be an incredible concert hall. Nice, hard, reflective surfaces on the side, lots of angles, a glass ceiling that's all wrinkly, basically mostly hard reflective surfaces. This has all the signature of a traditional concert hall. But this is not a concert hall. This is a speech assembly room. This room sounds a lot more like what a church where the main activity is speaking, not music, would sound like. This is a speech room for a pharmaceutical company, but the architect had this image. The architect is Frank Gehry. This was the image that he in fact wanted for the room. So how do we do this? How do we get this room to sound more or less dry and non-reverberant? Perforated glass, a little on the expensive side, but doable, and 50% of the wood are slotted and or perforated. Okay, so we don't even have to be limited by our traditional sort of mindset about what certain materials have to be. Okay, we don't, if we want spaces to be non-reverberant, we don't have to resort anymore to fabric-covered panels or drapes. We can use what appear to be hard surfaces, but we can perforate them. On the other hand, if we end up with too many absorbent surfaces, like acoustic ceiling tile, which seems to be the backbone of a lot of constructions, a lot of large churches end up with carpet on the floor, absorptive ceilings, and yet they need the church to sound big and live and reverberant. We can make that happen too. Sometimes we have to resort to enhancement systems. Again, this marriage between architecture, acoustics, and technology. That's the theme. All right, let's take a look at some worship houses. Okay, and this is more eye candy to set the stage for what I really want to talk about today, which is our project study, our study project, which is Crossroads Tabernacle. These are all churches where sort of architecture, technology, programming, acoustics, and in all instances, budget. We haven't really spent too much time talking about money, but money is always a part of it. This is a small church in Brazil. Okay, very simple. Nothing being invented. Another church, also in Brazil, actually tremendous church population in Brazil. It's huge, much larger than I would have ever guessed. A great space for viewing. This sort of semicircular, hemispherical shape is always a good one for viewing because the sight lines, everybody's very, very close, but does present some incredible acoustical issues. Coverage is a big deal, and the high exposed ceiling, which is really there because that's all the budget would allow, did cause this space to be very, very boomy, extremely reverberant, very, very hard to hear speech, and we were able to solve it with a combination of speaker location and well-placed panels. Okay, there's another view. Now the trick is to get the seats underneath the balcony to sound good. Okay, more views of the same church. Now this is not a church, this is a synagogue. It's a religious structure, but I like putting this one up. This is maybe the largest synagogue in New York, certainly the most famous, which is Central Synagogue. And needless to say, you can't be changing the acoustics in this room. You can't change any surface at all. So how do we get this kind of space that is just really is really an echo chamber for all intents and purposes, okay, to sound controlled. We have to do it with a lot of speakers directing sound exactly where we want it to be. And we have some slides that show it. You can see the speakers that were very carefully placed on the top of each of these decorative columns. Okay, this is a church in upstate New York. It's on the Vassar College campus, and an excellent example of a line array. Again, a church that could not be changed. I don't know if it was a legal reason, but it was certainly the mandate of the president of the university. And again, the solution, two very, very simple line arrays. DSP controlled speakers, there they are right there. Very, very simple vertical speakers. You can see them right over there. And another example of a church. So there's no limit. There's no limit to how we can combine these three huge items and cause this love affair to take place. More examples of churches. Okay, now I want to show you an example. This is one that's in construction, very, very large church in Brazil. We're going to skip over this. This is the area I want to spend a few minutes on before we go into our project example. And this is just one of the tools we use. These are the three verbs. Basically, we're designers. We're trying to predict. Okay, then of course we have to build, and we use a tool called oralization. This has been around for a while. It's finally at the point where I would say it is at a desktop computer level. In other words, it's affordable, it's obtainable. It's not the kind of thing that everybody wants to be purchasing and learning how to use, but it's affordable, and there really should be no reason why anybody planning and or designing a church, which is a large assembly space, should not take advantage of oralization techniques. And I'm going to need my assistant's help back there, right? You're ready to go with this? We figured out how to finally get this. So let's take a look at this church. Now, this is a small church in western Switzerland, the La Nemours Church, which is in existence not particularly far from the Ronchamp monastery that Corbusier designed in the 50s in eastern France, just across the border. They even borrowed some of the architecture. And let's take a look at the inside of this church. You don't have to know too much about acoustics to imagine that this is more or less an echo chamber. There's not an absorptive surface in this space. Concrete floors, stone wall, concrete side walls, wooden pews, even the ceiling is slatted pieces of wood. This is an echo chamber. The material that's, and basically what happens every Sunday? Does a band perform? Is there a choir? No. The performance every Sunday, the acoustic performance every Sunday, is a man talking. I forget the exact sect denomination of this church, but basically it's a man speaking. Well, nobody could hear him. I mean, they just couldn't really intelligently listen to him. And this small community somehow recognized that this problem would have to be solved architecturally and electroacoustically. It was very interesting. This is not in the middle of a big city either. How we got the job and how we moved forward is a sort of another story. But let's take a look at the tool that we use. There's a view looking back, again, reinforcing my basic premise. This is an echo chamber with no intelligibility in the spoken voice. What did we use? We used a tool called oralization. There are three, more or less at this point, three, although I just saw a fourth one a few weeks ago at the AES in New York, three leading programs that do this kind of work: Cat Acoustics, Odeon, and there's a third one, the name slips my mind right now. We use them all, but the one we prefer is Cat Acoustics. This is a model in Cat Acoustics. Now, it sort of looks like a 3D rendering, but it's really not, and it's an acoustic model. So it's not a realistic model, but it is the building. And what it represents is enough depiction of the surfaces so that we can assign values to the surfaces. Once we can assign acoustic values to the surfaces, like absorption or reflection or diffusion or scattering, and we have this information for most materials, and if we don't have it for a material, we take a good guess at it, okay? Then it now becomes relatively trivial in this model, this computer model, to put a speaker or a source and a listening position, like a person. Once we do that, we can then get the impulse response, which is essentially the acoustic signature of an existing space, except the space doesn't exist. In this case, it does exist, but it exists in the computer model. So let's take a look at what that would give us. This is a pretty simple curve. Everybody this is about the most technology we'll do today. This is a graph that basically shows measured reverb time. I think everybody has some idea of what that means. It's the amount of time that it takes for energy to decay 60 decibels. And it's a measure of how much reverberation is in the space. The more reverberation, usually the less intelligibility. Okay? Versus frequency. Well, look at some of those numbers. At 500 hertz, we're at 5-6 seconds. It goes up to 7 seconds. This is the Grand Canyon. I mean, this is a very, very reverberant space. That church might have had more reverberation than this hall. Certainly more reverberation than this hall when it's full. Maybe it equaled this hall when it's empty and there's no carpet on the floor. Okay, let's listen to what this hall sounded like. So if you could now hit that top button. That literally is sort of like it's not a gun. It was just a sound that we put through the sound. So you can do it again. Just hit. That's the reverberation time in that space. And now hit the second one. You might have to tone it down a little.
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
Okay, that's one of those little sentences that has every vowel and every consonant in it. That we own a lot of these. Do it again.
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
Okay, it's in any infinitely number of words can be heard, blah, blah, blah. And obviously, it's not particularly clear. It's not terribly intelligent, okay? Now, when we did the presentation to the building committee, 5 people in Western Switzerland who had no idea what that graph meant, as you can imagine. Imagine your building committee, your steering committee for the church, okay? They didn't care about that, but they have ears. And we brought in 5 headphones, calibrated, etc. And we did that oralization. We did that little tape, that little sentence twice. They both sounded exactly the same. And when we told them that the first one was in fact recorded in the church, everybody said, yeah, that's what the church sounds like. The second one was generated from the model, from the computer model. We took a dry version of that recording and pushed it through the computer model. We essentially convolved it. Basically, it's going backwards on an impulse response. I don't want to even get into that. And demonstrated that this technology would be able to predict what this church would sound like, and in fact did sound like, from a computer model. Well, besides getting the job instantly, we now had a valuable tool. And what we did was we just kept tweaking the surfaces until the current recording and the predicted recording were exactly the same, because a lot of the surfaces we didn't have data for, like that big rock wall. Now the fun starts. Now if you go to the next slide, okay. Well, now the design I have to go to the next slide, sorry. Okay, now comes the designing part. Remember, we had prediction, design, and oralization. Computers don't design. Anybody that thinks that computers design is just people design. It's still the same process. So this slide represents the goal curve. What are we trying to bring the reverberation down to so that we have intelligibility? Well, this is research, intuition, measuring other churches, a little bit of reverse engineering, kind of thinking about which surfaces we could change. It should be pretty obvious to you the only surface we could have changed was the ceiling. We weren't allowed to change anything else, okay? But once we got the goal curve, which we intuitively as designers thought would work, now for the proof is in the pudding. Proof is in the listening, not the pudding, the listening, sorry. Okay, so now if you can click the top button for me, already you can begin to hear that this is going to sound better. And now the words, the second button.
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
It's distorting a little bit, but you can now begin to see that we can hear the words. Okay? And we could have made it a little bit deader. What would we have had to do? Well, we've had to spend more money because we need more surface treatment. But actually, that's dead enough. We want a little God. I need a little reverberation. I call it a little Charlton Heston. Okay, we need a little God. It's a church. It's not supposed to be a lecture hall. Okay, so now everybody was signed off. So this tool, this oralization tool, allowed us to design, and I'm just giving you a quick PowerPoint summary. We did this many times. We do this on projects where we're sending files, sometimes 3,000 miles to clients, and they're listening and back and forth and back and forth. Everybody should be using this kind of tool. I'm not going to get into the merits of the 3 different software programs. Okay. And then, of course, once we were signed off, then we went into execution, which basically we took down all the slatted wood, basically put up on the ceiling 3 different thicknesses of insulation, which you can see on the left-hand slide, and then put the slats back on, okay? And there's the measured against the predicted, those bottom 2. And you can see that they were very, very accurate. This is a very, very accurate tool, okay? And this is just one example of technology really assisting design and really reinforcing this love affair that I'm basically trying to get everybody to come on board with. Anyway, that's our first half, and obviously in 30 minutes we can't be talking about acoustics for worship spaces. All we can do is get everybody to just fall in love with this subject and to not be afraid of it. By way of setting the table for Joe to do the rest of the work, thank goodness, I guess it is 10 years ago, or maybe 12 years ago, Pastor Joe, who actually wasn't a pastor, was in charge of the music for the Crossroads Tabernacle Church in the Bronx, New York. He was the leader of the house band. Joe is a musician, pretty well-known musician. We won't get into that. His parents, mom, was actually the pastor and founded the church, I believe. And this was a thriving church in doing the best it could in its environment, not as you see it today. And basically, Joe had a small studio, and that sets the stage for how he contacted me and how my life changed, and I guess our life changed, and how we're using this as a sort of real-world example of how architecture and technology and I guess the Spirit of God a little bit. We may have different versions of God, but it's the same God sooner or later. I assure. At least I believe it is, and how our lives changed, and how what looked to be impossible wasn't impossible. So I think by way of a real-world example, the story of Crossroads is one that wants to be told, and I'm going to let Joe do the telling. I'll just push the slides along.
Okay, thank you. I think you can you hear me okay on this mic? Am I okay? Like John said, we were a church that was birthed in 1983. My mother, Amy Cortese, was the founder of it. And we were in a storefront. And within this storefront, we still had a small recording studio. Music, multimedia, production, theater, performing arts in general was always a major part of how we proclaim gospel at Crossroads. So we had a studio there, and then the Lord opened up a door for us to purchase a 1927 theater. This is a vaudeville.
Hold on, I'm going to interrupt for 1 second.
Sure.
I'm going to interrupt. Okay, and I realized that it was slightly out of order. I forgot the order of the slides. I wanted to show. I always tell people sometimes this was a church that basically now has a real recording studio. This is a recording studio that ended up in a church, and that's what this slide is. Okay, so this is a church that became a recording studio.
Oh, wow, okay.
Now we're back to Joe. Okay.
So there you go.
That sets the stage for
the
Joe's
Three
talk.
Stooges performed here. Jerry Lewis performed here. And we know all of this not only through some history books, but we also have an American Legion office down the block with men that are in there that are in their late 80s and 90s and have been in that area their entire life. And they inform us of the kind of things that happened in this space. When we moved into this space, it was, after it was a theater, a movie theater, it turned into a retail space. So the pitched floor was filled in with, I don't know how many pounds, I don't know how much concrete they were able to get in there, but they basically took the theater and made it flat. And it became like a sweatshop. You could see the fluorescent lights were hanging, and it was really a dark hole. There was so much detail up in the ceiling that you couldn't really see. We got in there, we gutted it out, and we got it ready to hold worship services. But here's where things get really crazy. My mother said, before we do anything, where is the recording studio going? I looked at my mom, I said, Mom, this is a church. Don't you think we should first work on the sanctuary? This is the sanctuary in, I believe, 1945. As you can see, 1,000-seat theater, super high ceilings, there's the projection room in the back, and the theater is pitched. So now they flatten it up. I'll get to the genius of that in a second. But Mom said, where's the studio going? So I realized at this point, Mom, I don't think we should be building or talking about a recording studio. My mom's telling me this in her 70s. But my mom knew a few things that I didn't know. The first thing is that, son, I'm passing the mantle on to you. But there's also a bunch of angry wolves that are going to try to mess with you, dethrone you, and make sure that you don't become the pastor of this church, and you'll never be able at that point to put in a recording studio because they don't have the vision for it. They don't understand that this recording studio is a major portal for gospel proclamation in the style of Crossroads. So before we built the sanctuary and before we even built the main offices, she said, let's build a recording studio just like we had. I said, okay. What do you want me to do? She says, go get the best. Now, remember, I'm a musician as well. I'm also an engineer. And if you're an engineer here and you love studios and you buy Mix magazine, you realize that half the issues on the cover are designed by this man. And so I said, well, Mom, the best is the Walters-Storyk Design Group, and I don't think we can afford them. She says, what do we have to lose? Call them up. And so I said, okay, and I just was acting obedient, and I looked up Walters-Storyk Design Group. I called, and you know, while John Storyk and his entire firm are some of the most forward-thinking people, especially when you see their construction, they still have some old world qualities to them, which is this. The projects they take on have very much to do with that first phone call. And I said, well, we're a local church and we want to build a studio and yada, yada, yada. And I don't think this conversation is going to get farther than the first call. And he says, well, where are you at? And me and my wife would like to come down and visit. We said, okay. I said, Mom, guess what? The Walters-Storyk Design Group are going to come. And they popped into Crossroads. And him and his wife walked in, pretty impressive people. And I couldn't believe that they were here. I was wondering how much it was going to cost me just to have them come here, but it didn't cost me anything. They walked into the space, and the first thing that happened was they said, okay, what do you want to do? And I said, well, we want to build a recording studio, and this is the area. We had to walk them through the building, the rest of the sanctuary, the black hole, to this area where he's pointing out to now. But on the way into that space, they just spent a lot of time looking around, you know. So I said, well, this is the sanctuary. These are the offices, but you don't want to look at this. Let's go to the studio area. They went to the studio area. They looked around. And they said, okay, we can do it. Now, what are you going to do over there? And I said, well, again, that's the sanctuary. I'm not going to have a sanctuary conversation with this man because I know that I can't even afford the studio. I'm just being obedient to my mother. So let's not even get into anything else. But the Walters-Storyk Design Group, again, they're approaching, or if they haven't already, done 3,000 rooms. And I got the feeling, he talked about the Spirit of God, and he's on our turf now. Evangelicals out there, he's on our turf now. My Jewish friend here. Truly, the Spirit of God was moving.
Not that Jewish.
Well, he's a bar mitzvah Jew.
Not that Jewish.
But anyway, he says, I got the feeling that of all the projects that they had done, which are mainly, you know, profit projects as well, that this was the first place that they came into that really had nothing to do with profit or anything else. It was a local church committed to a local community to bring the good news in creative, unorthodox ways. And they wanted to see the whole thing. It's almost like they didn't want to do the studio unless we went ahead and told them that they can actually do the whole building. You want to interject?
Let's get a setting. What's going on here? The area that Joe, I can't get this to, is right. This is a street. This is actually a pretty busy street in the Bronx. It's really noisy, and it's this little area on the ground floor that looked like the best place for the studio. It really looked like the only place because we wanted to have an entrance off the street so that it could work as a studio without having to sort of walk through everything to get to it. Because Joe's vision of the studio was not only to support the church, but also to support the community work as a recording studio, which it has for many years. The second floor was a no-brainer. That was the obvious location for classrooms because that had the best ceiling height. And that left the area down here, and now this plan makes a lot of sense, for offices and reception. Okay? And then this big space that looked more or less like what you just saw, that's not what you see here. This is the vision that we sort of throughout as we moved forward. But it just became obvious that even if they couldn't all be afforded to be built at the same time, they should be conceived at the same time. The architecture should be conceived at the same time, the technology, the connectivity, how are these rooms going to talk to each other? And even if there wasn't enough money, clearly there wasn't enough money. I mean, there's never enough money. I mean, I guess maybe sometimes there's enough money, but there wasn't enough money to do this, okay? And certainly the church had other priorities, but we need to put the infrastructure in. And that's where things got interesting. What I found fascinating was Joe's decision, and I guess I'm now hearing, well, I've heard the story a few times, but it always amazes me that it was really your mom, elected to put the studio in first. It seemed to me I would have put the studio in last. I would have thought of the studio as an appendage, as an amenity, as icing on the cake. But it's your mom who actually realized that it was anything but. Put the studio in first, okay, maybe not every last piece of equipment, and that's exactly what we did. This was in fact built first. And so over, about 10 years ago, while the Tabernacle side was still not the way it looks now, and you'll see how it looks now, this basically state-of-the-art recording studio rose out of the ashes in the Bronx, New York. In fact, weeks after it opened, the word sort of got out, wait a second, there's a professional recording studio in the Bronx that was sort of built to serve the church, record Sunday programs, other kinds of weekday programs. But the word got out, and it has been used as a commercial studio, among other things. This is state-of-the-art studio. This was Joe's vision, and this was what was built 10 years ago. And
for an area in the Bronx, the South Bronx, one of the poorest congressional districts in the entire, if not the poorest congressional district in the entire country. And a place like this, with a church like this, is just a beautiful breath of fresh air to a community that never in a million years could have thought it could see anything like this in that place. And every time people come into it, they're like, they can't even believe that they're in the Bronx, but they are. And again, my mom was the one that understood that preaching is obviously one huge way of communicating the gospel, but Crossroads was going to be using a lot of other things to communicate gospel, not just from the pulpit, but it was going to be through the way it recorded music and the way it did, media and all these other things. And here we are 10, 15 years later, and she nailed it. And she told us this in her 70s. So we're really grateful that she pressed in to this, and all the cynics and all the, the people that the church splitters really could do nothing, because Pastor Amy was the one that pulled the trigger on this. And now we're able to really see it do some amazing things. It's used every day, and it's a beautiful place. And when we do have nooks and crannies of other space, other projects will come in and use it. And it's not, it's still on the project side. It's not huge. I love the amount of space that it takes up in the scope of the entire building. But I think it'd be a good idea to shift over now to the
try to get that in perspective.
Sanctuary, yeah.
See, it's interesting because even though it was built first, it's still small. It's the correct proportion. I show the studio a lot. I mean, when I teach a course in studio design, and when I show this studio, I usually start off by saying, this is an amazing studio for a church. And then my next sentence is, this is a pretty amazing studio, period. There's 50,000 project studios. This is what everybody wants. This is the recording studio that all the kids want. Small, tight, 350 square foot control room. The equipment is modest, okay? Equipment is fungible. I don't mean to diminish equipment. I love equipment, and everybody here, I'm sure, loves equipment. But equipment is fungible. Equipment is meant to change. Mm-hmm. Equipment probably has, with the exception of vintage microphones and some other equipment, has a life cycle of 5 years or 6 years. Not necessarily because it breaks, but because it's a computer. We all know about that. But the infrastructure, the bones, the construction, okay, of this studio was solid. It was solid from day one. 1,200 square feet, not a lot. Everything is contained inside the 1,200 square feet. Okay, small lounge, okay, which is needed for all kinds of reasons, as you can imagine. A sound lock, which gets us, keeps it from the lounge to the studio. But by putting another door here, we actually got 2 sound locks, which gave us 1, 2, and then a small little guy over here, because of the geometry, 3 ISO booths or vocal booths, and then a studio. And all those doors that you see over there on that wall, which you can easily see in this picture, are variable acoustic panels, because it was obvious even from the beginning that this church, in making a studio, had to be a studio for the community. Joe lives in the Crossroads is in a very, very diverse community. There's a lot of ethnic music, a lot of Puerto Rican music, jazz music, singers. So if a singer is recording, we need to open those panels, make the room on the dry side, throw out a rug. On the other hand, if there's a 10-piece Latin band in there with a lot of acoustic instruments, we need to make that room a little bit brighter. How do we do it? Basically a bunch of doors that open and close, okay? I didn't consider this to be that much ahead of its time. We use this almost in every studio now, in almost every studio we build. It was built on budget. It was a stretch for the church, but we did get it done, and isolated from Castle Hill Avenue, which is one of the noisiest roads in the Bronx. So this was chapter 1. Little did we know there'd be a chapter 2 and a chapter 3. But let's talk about. I mean, we knew that there was that space on the other side. Let's just put it in perspective again. Okay, this was the big animal waiting to be tamed. Remember, while this is being built, and then at the same time, the classrooms went upstairs. We don't really have any slides of those. Those were fairly straightforward. Mm-hmm. So this entire skinny wing was all developed more or less at the same time, while everybody was in the church sort of, why is all the money being spent over here? And I guess there were some doubters. I don't know. You'll have to comment on whether there were doubters to this direction or not. But it didn't take long before planning started for this. I'll let Joe take us through this.
Then the sanctuary was the next part, and that took a little bit longer. We needed to wait on some financing to come in. I don't know if AG Financial is here, but if they are here, visit them, because we've gone through them twice, and they've been a tremendous help to us. We moved into the sanctuary, and what I love about the sanctuary, folks, at the end of the day, our studio is like a mobile truck to the sanctuary.
It's a truck without wheels.
It's a truck without wheels. Yeah. So think about that. But once you get into the sanctuary, there were some new challenges that were happening, and Walters-Storyk Design Group took the time to listen to the vision, not only the vision of what happens every day, but what could be happening in the future. When you're talking about a 1,000-seat auditorium and a flat ground, you're going to have sightline problems. It's a major problem. And for a few years, we were doing concerts and all kind of theater productions, but people in the back couldn't see. When they came in to design, they figured out a way how to get pitch back to a flat floor, and that was to build what we would call stadium-style seats. I don't want to call them bleachers, because they could be looked at as bleachers, but Crossroads also wears many different hats. So if you notice, these were the first renderings that came up. The ground level was, it was like split in half. We also hold galas, dinners, dinner theater, VBS, auditorium, where you need a huge space empty. So the floor level was chairs that are removable with a parquet floor, looks like the Boston Garden. And then the second half of the theater was this raised seating. I am not lying to you when I tell you that the best seat in the house is the last seat in the balcony. It's amazing, because you can't even believe you're sitting in a 800 to 1,000 seat space.
I think one of the challenges was when I went there a few times, and Crossroads didn't have the luxury of an assembly room. There was no other room to have events. It just doesn't have it. There's a few classrooms upstairs, but even the largest classroom upstairs only holds about 30 or 40 people. They are not event spaces. There's no exiting, there's no kitchen facilities. So the events, social events, which are huge, have to take place in the sanctuary. Other churches, of course, have an event room. Maybe it's in the basement, maybe it's below the sanctuary. So the thinking was, let's just do the opposite. Let's put the fixed seats in the back and put the temporary seats in the front. And it seems to have worked out. Once I think that decision was made, and that caught everybody a little bit off guard, and once that decision was made, then I think everything else fell into place. The other advantage of raking, which seemed like an extra expense is that we got all that space underneath, which was
we had no lobby, John.
There was no lobby, and there was no
lobby.
storage. Yeah.
So by giving us those, like you said, the raised seating, we were able to gain a lobby. We were able to gain 3 multi-purpose rooms that today serve as part of the pantry ministry. The nursery is back there underneath one of those bleachers. Another large space that we hold for multi-purposes are underneath those bleachers. So we were able to maximize the space. Again, budget was extremely limited. And when you talk about equipment in this thing, I just want to make one point. If he said earlier, if you leave home with one thing, let me send you home with another thing, because there may be some people here that are either in a committee or in leadership and have to bring up this conversation. We could not get the equipment that we wanted. The entire lighting system that's there is very impressive, but it's all used gear that came off a tour. The Meyer sound system that we wanted, could not get it, could not even think about it. So all we could do was put up what we had. What we had is still up there today. The reason why what we had, which is very middle of the road, maybe some of you might even laugh if I call out the name, and I'm not, sounds amazing. The reason why it sounds amazing is because it starts with the walls and the floor and the design. When you build it right from beginning, you can hang up junk and it sounds amazing because the room is right. If we were to go ahead and me secretly start investing in all the gear that I wanted, like he said, 3 to 5 years, it would be dead, and we'd still have problems. So if I can stick a feather in my cap, and if I'm proud of anything, oh, there it is today. If I'm proud of anything, it's the fact that we treated the space, John treated the space with the same kind of criteria as that recording studio. They actually look like they marry, very similar materials, very similar look. But when you come into that space, people love to go up to the speakers and the console and they look at what we have and they go, oh my God, I can't believe it. It's like, how do you guys get the sound that you get in this space? And we say, because it really has very little to do with the gear. It has everything to do with the fact that we built the room right from the ground up.
I fully expected the gear to change during the 10 years. It's delightful. It's not the first time I've heard this, to hear that in fact the basic sound system hasn't changed. I guess if it's not broken, there's really no reason to fix it. For us, what Joe just stated was not that unusual, because as you've heard for the last hour, we don't make a distinction between architecture and acoustics. Mm-hmm. Actually, it's the other way around. We really start looking at the acoustics, and then the architecture falls into place itself. Okay, so positioning the line array was the most important thing for us. If the position is right, you can get the line array to work. Most line arrays are working backwards if the position is not correct. The walls being treated were critical. Most of the thinking in line arrays, okay, particularly the horizontal dispersion, many of you know that, is what do we have to do to angle that and to keep the sound off the side walls. Side walls are usually a liability when it comes to intelligibility. Not so in a concert hall, but certainly in an intelligibility situation like this. So we didn't have that luxury. We didn't have the ability to go get a $150,000 custom designed line array from Myers or L Acoustics or any of the brands now that a lot of you are familiar with, where you can almost predict exactly where everything's going to go. We had to use what Joe owned. So I said, well, okay, let's just kill the walls. Let's just get the right treatments up on the walls. And we did spend a little extra money. At the same time, why not make it look good? Why not make everybody proud of the church? And we didn't have to spend a lot, but we did it. It's still there. That's what all the side panels are. Some diffusive, some absorptive. The real trick in the space was how to deal with the dome. Mm-hmm. Let's go back and look at that dome. Now, let's go back to what the place looked like. There's the dome when it was a theater. Of course, there's the dome disappearing because you can't see it because it got covered with fluorescent lights. Obviously, they came down. And again, this beautiful dome, which it was and still is just an amazing architectural shape that was done, but a huge liability. I mean, really the last thing we need is a focusing hard surface dome in a room where we have enough intelligibility problems to deal with. So solution. Well, solution one would be to kill the dome, but that didn't make any sense. So solution two was to enhance the dome, relight it, clean it up, basically plasters and spacklers, and get that middle surface, put a nice fixture in the middle, and the trick was make it absorptive. Okay, we went through a number of iterations. There were really only two ways that we could approach it. One was fabric covered, which was very expensive and very tricky to do. Remember, this is 25 feet in the air. Today, we could use perforated wood panels. There's a lot of products on the market, but 10 years ago, the only real solution we could use was basically K13, and there's actually somebody showing that here. They've been here for a number of years, a local K13 product specialist. And K13, which sort of looks like architectural fireproofing, sometimes is not the prettiest surface, but we did a test. We determined that at 25 feet, if we lit it correctly and gave it a little color, wouldn't really be that bad and actually would kind of have a nice quality to it. And that's exactly what that is. Very, very cheap installation. Not expensive at all, and did the job. So what was a liability now became an asset. Okay, and that dome saves the day.
And that dome is, we're probably going to address that dome again because there's now, like you said, there's other things, but even painting and the detail that we really want to get up in that dome and bring out some more of the detail that's up there. It's some beautiful stuff that you really can't tell from the picture, and even some better lighting. But when you come into the church, the dome is almost the entire size of the entire church. It's really impressive. And it's nice
I like Joe's comment that the best seat, actually I always thought the best seat was about 10 rows back in the balcony, and the last row, of course. But even the last row is not bad, and we knew that the church is full, right? I think at the 11 o'clock in the morning, it's full. I mean, so every seat is used. And it's important that the last few rows get the same experience as the first few rows. So even that treatment way in the back wall, which is diffusers, has a moment, has a rhyme and a reason to it.
People will come to Crossroads and wait in the lobby because they don't want to sit on the ground level. They want to go up into these bleachers. It's kind of funny. We bust on them, but anyway. It just works. It feels very intimate and cozy.
I guess by way of concluding the slides, and then we can just open up for questions. Joe shot, these are some examples of some of the functions that you can take.
Again, Vacation Bible School. So we need the chairs taken out so that the floor space can become this giant play area for that, and parents can go hang out in the balcony and watch VBS or any other kind of event. Again,
the church did not have the luxury of an assembly room, of a function room, or even a pre-function room. The lobby is the pre-function room. The sanctuary is the assembly space. I think it's kind of cool on a Saturday morning that the community, all these kids, are in the same space that on Sunday is a worship space. I don't know. I think people know that. I think there's something special about that.
Again, to the left is a musical that we did called Beyond All Time, a tribute to the music of Ralph Carmichael, I believe. It was a dinner theater event. That's Matthew Rushing in the left. He is the principal dancer for the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater. For those of you that are familiar with Alvin Ailey, he's now their associate director, but he's been their lead dancer for the past 20 years. He worships at Crossroads. So Crossroads has a lot of traffic from the Broadway community, the arts community, the performing arts community, because that's really what we bleed, and we feel a strong calling to that demographic as well. On the right side is a dance concert. The Bowdoin Center Performing Arts. Crossroads on Mondays takes off one hat, puts on another hat, and we become a performing arts center. And the whole building just shifts. And this is really the best way for us to also get community. There are more people in our performing arts center from the community that are non-believers, I guess I can say that here, non-believers, than those that come from the church. So Bowdoin Center, who knows, you may 10 years from now, if we're back here, it may not say Crossroads Tabernacle on the outside. It may say the Bowdoin Center. And Crossroads uses that space because Crossroads is a threatening word. Crossroads Tabernacle in an almost all Muslim community is a threatening word. Vacation Bible School, that's dead. We need totally new language without skipping the gospel. So the Bowdoin Center Performing Arts is really an important place within the church culture, because in our community now, it's changed in 30 years. It's like I said, it's almost majority Muslim. Muslims are not, the Muslim faith, they're not threatened by the arts. They're not threatened by music. They're not threatened by dance. But the church, Crossroads, is just, that's a no-no. So we're grateful for Bowdoin, because while we do bleed the performing arts, it's also an excuse for us to rub up against our community and build relationships with them. Here's another advertisement for another concert, audience of one. Parakletos, the Storytellers, which is a pretty well-known hip-hop ministry out of New York City. This is one of the events that they did. This is a concert at the Performing Arts Center. That's the jazz ensemble that's playing. And so the church will turn into a little Carnegie Hall.
Even the cross is removable, right? I mean,
that's right. We have a beautiful cross that is such an eyesore. It stays there. And we don't want it to move. But it can't come out.
It can't come out.
Ballerinas, at the Performing Arts Center at Crossroads, dancing. Private music lessons go on. John talked about these rooms, these 5 rooms that are in the second level. Those are classrooms on Sunday for Sunday school. They're small group rooms for midweek. And then on Monday, they're private lessons. Fine art classes also going on there. Of course, baptism on Sunday. We don't have a baptism built into the place. We didn't really want it, because we went with something that just gets built up in a few minutes and comes down.
That's it. So just so that we'll just put this slide on as we continue to talk about. Anyway, I just think I think it's interesting to have together march forward in what was a challenging experiment for me. Forever, I thought it was upside down. I couldn't believe that a church would put a studio in before they went and fixed up their church. We've since been involved in a number of recording studios in churches, usually existing churches, and we've been involved in a number of churches. But this is, for me, this still is the first time that what appeared to be backwards, really, I guess, as time, as it's now stood the test of time, it turns out that music, the dedication to music, which was more than music, the music is synonymous to the community. And when I see those slides, I haven't really seen those slides until a few weeks ago, until Joe sent them to me. It's my loss that I don't go to the church more often. But for me personally, I love the fact that this is a church on Sundays, it's a school on Wednesday nights, it's a theater on Saturday. Anybody from New York knows that theater and the arts is being challenged. It's being challenged in every community, okay, from the federal government down. Our funding is just disappearing. It may be that the churches might be the last gap, the last gasp of our society to actually keep our theater and our arts going. And I even like hearing that people of other faith, including faiths that really are at odds sometimes with what happens here on a Sunday, still can participate in the building. Okay? This was, after all, a building project inspired by God, but nevertheless a building project that married architecture, acoustics, and technology. So for me, it was an honor to be involved, and it's an honor to still be involved with Joe professionally and with Joe as a friend. So with that, maybe we would entertain any questions, or if you have any questions, we can field those. If not, I guess we can just bring this to conclusion. Anybody want to? Any thoughts, ideas? Anybody have churches with studios? I know in Brazil, almost no church that we've done doesn't have a recording studio. Yeah. I'll repeat the question. Yeah. How big is this question was, how big is the sanctuary? It's 1,000 people, and it was, what's about 150 feet long by 80 feet, something like that kind of number. I should know that. Actually, I did know that, but I don't know it anymore.
And I never knew it, so.
Yeah, but it's not that hard to figure out. Yeah, I think it's about 150 by 80, that kind of number. It's 1,000 people. We didn't really change the seating population. I mean, the seats were always there. We just made them all usable. I mean, basically everybody, no one in the back could see anything. I mean, it was ridiculous. I remember the first service that I went to, and that was my first question: does anybody see anything? And the answer is they don't. They didn't see anything. I said, well, that's just unacceptable. I did want to point out one other thing. Again, a tribute to Joe and to his mom, who I miss seeing. Right there, many a church would take the absolute prime best location, and this is one of the prime best locations, okay? And I've been in many a church and many an auditorium where they will not dedicate it to the lighting and sound guys, but not so at Crossroads, okay? Again, consistent with the mission here, okay? Because if this is going to be a theater on Saturday, we can't be taking the sound and lighting guy and shoving him off on the side, which, okay, or putting him up in the back with his head all against the back wall. I'm sure there's some sound people here, okay? So that lighting and sound booth, and it's pretty substantial too, sucked up about 10 or 12 of the best seats in the house, is exactly where it's supposed to be, okay? And I've been in many auditoriums and many churches where they just won't give in on that seat, but not in this church, okay? And that was quite a credit to Joe and the team. All right. Well, thank you. Thank everybody for coming and starting us off.
Yeah.
Thanks for the technical team for helping. Have a good show.